I pushed open the heavy metal fire door, expecting the concrete landing of the stairwell and the cool draft of the basement air. Instead, I stepped into a corridor that looked exactly like the office floor I had just left, but stretched. The carpet was the same muted beige, speckled with tiny, multicolored flecks of gray and blue, compressed tight from years of foot traffic. The drop ceiling had the same rectangular fiberglass panels, the same water stain in the corner near the ventilation grate, shaped vaguely like a map of Australia. But the perspective was wrong. The walls didn't recede into a vanishing point like they should have. They ran parallel to each other, stretching into a distance that made my eyes hurt, creating a tunnel of endless beige that blurred into a yellowish haze. I checked behind me to go back. The stairwell door was gone, just a smooth continuation of the wall. The paint was fresh, smelling of latex and nothingness. No seam, no frame, no hinges, just wall. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the absolute quiet. It was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, physical, like it's pressing against your eardrums. It wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory, waiting for me to make a sound so it could swallow it. I took a tentative step forward. My boot hit the carpet. I felt the impact through my soul, the compression of the synthetic fibers against the rubber heel. Then, half a second later, I heard it. Thud. The sound of my footstep echoed down the hall, delayed as if it had traveled a great distance to reach me, or like it was being played from a recording that was lagging behind the video. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I looked down at the floor, then stomped my foot hard. I felt the vibration instantly, traveling up my shin and settling in my knee. But the sound, the heavy, dull crunch of the rubber on the fibers, didn't happen until I had already lifted my foot to take another step. It was disorienting, deeply nauseating, like watching a movie with the audio track out of sync. I tried again, taking 3 quick steps. 1, 2, 3. I felt the rhythm of my movement, the sway of my hips, the swing of my arms, the familiar mechanics of walking, but the sound came back as a chaotic jumble. Thud, 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 thud. The footsteps were scrambling over each other, arriving late and out of order, overlapping in a way that no natural echo could produce. I stopped walking abruptly. The silence that followed was immediate. Too immediate. It felt like the silence had been waiting for me to stop, ready to cut in the exact millisecond I paused, erasing the noise of my movement instantly. I looked up at the lights overhead. Long fluorescent tubes ran the length of the ceiling, encased in dusty plastic diffusers. They were off. The hall was dim, lit only by a faint, ambient yellow glow that seemed to come from nowhere, staining the air like old varnish. I needed light. I reached out to feel for the switch on the wall, but there was no plate, just smooth, cool paint. I turned back to the hallway, a chill creeping down my spine. Maybe if I kept walking, I'd find an exit, or maybe the glitch would resolve itself. I started walking again. Step, step. The delayed footsteps followed me like a reluctant shadow, echoing seconds after I had passed. Then, ahead of me, the lights began to flicker. But the sound came first. Before the bulbs even flared, I heard the electric buzz, a sharp, high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. A second later, the lights stuttered on, buzzing in time with the phantom sound I had already heard. It was predicting the light. The audio was loading before the visual. The environment was buffering my presence before I even arrived. I walked faster, my breathing shallow. The hallway was endless. No doors, no intersections, no emergency exits. Just the same stretch of beige carpet and a water cooler. It was empty, the large plastic bottle bone dry. The plastic crinkled slightly, as if it had been crushed and reinflated incorrectly. I passed a potted plant. The leaves were dusty and plastic, bent at an impossible angle that suggested gravity had been applied sideways. I passed the water cooler again. I stopped dead in my tracks. I looked behind me. The plant was there. The cooler was there. I had turned around, but the landmarks had repeated. I was in a loop. I turned back around and kept walking, my eyes scanning the walls for a change, any deviation in the pattern. The delay was getting shorter. I took a step, and the sound was only a fraction of a second late. The synchronization was tightening. It felt like the world was catching up to me, calculating my trajectory with greater precision, adjusting the latency. I tried to run. I sprinted down the hallway, my breath ragged in my throat. Thud, 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 thud. The sounds were merging now, layering on top of each other until it sounded like a crowd of people were running with me, their footsteps overlapping mine. A cacophony of delayed echoes bouncing off walls I couldn't see. I skidded to a halt, my shoes squeaking on the carpet. The silence slammed down instantly. It didn't fade in. It just snapped into existence. That was the most unsettling part, the precision of the silence. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was a deliberate muting, a pause in the playback. I stood perfectly still. I held my breath. I looked at the wall beside me. There was a seam in the wallpaper, a thin, vertical line where the pattern didn't quite match up. I stared at it. I watched it. Slowly, the line began to shimmer. It looked like a graphics error on a computer screen. The texture of the wall was blurring, resolving itself into a flat, blocky color, then sharpening again. It was buffering. The environment was struggling to render my stillness. I realized then that the space wasn't broken. I was the problem. My presence here was causing a lag. I was a heavy file that the system couldn't load properly. The delay wasn't a glitch in the physics of the place, it was a processing error. I decided to test it. I closed my eyes. I counted to 3. On 3, I clapped my hands. I didn't clap, I just thought about it. I visualized the clap. I felt the urge to clap. Clap! The sound happened. My hands were still at my sides. The sound of a clap, sharp and loud, echoed in the hall, coming from a speaker I couldn't see. I flinched. I hadn't moved. The system had anticipated my intent. It had played the sound before I executed the action. I opened my eyes. The hallway was changing. The walls were closing in. Not physically sliding together, but the perspective was shifting. The ceiling felt lower. The air felt thinner. I walked. The delay was gone. My footsteps matched my movements perfectly. Step, step. The sync was 100%, but it didn't feel right. It felt artificial. The precision was terrifying. There was no drift, no echo, no variation. It was a perfect loop of cause and effect. I stopped. The silence was instant. I waited. I didn't move. I didn't think. I tried to be as blank as possible. If I didn't provide input, maybe the system would stop processing. The lights hummed, a low, steady drone. It wasn't the sound of electricity. It was the sound of a hard drive spinning. The hum grew louder. It vibrated in my chest. I looked at the floor. The carpet pattern was repeating. The little swirls and flecks of color were looping every 6 inches. I looked at the wall. The texture of the paint was repeating. The brush marks were the same over and over. I was standing in a texture map, a small copied patch of data that had been stretched to infinity. I took a step. The carpet felt hard, like concrete covered in a thin layer of felt. I took another saw a door ahead, a dark wood door with a brass handle. It hadn't been there before. I walked toward it. The handle was waiting. I reached out. My hand moved toward the brass. I was 6 inches away. Click. I heard the latch turn. I hadn't touched it yet. I grabbed the handle. It was cold. Too cold. It felt like frozen metal. I turned it. The door opened easily. No resistance. No friction. It swung inward on silent hinges. Inside it was dark. Not just shadow, but a flat, absolute black. No light could penetrate it. I looked into the darkness. I felt a pull. Not a physical force, but a data pull. Like a magnet attracting iron filings. I was being drawn into the empty space. I stepped back. I let go of the door. It swung shut. The sound of it closing came before the door actually touched the frame. Thud. Then the door moved. The visual lag was back, but in reverse. The sound was happening before the action. I turned away from the door. I started walking again. I needed to find a way out. I needed to find a different asset, a different texture. The hallway stretched on. I passed the water cooler again, the empty bottle, the plastic plant. The loop was resetting. I was trapped in a corridor of recycled assets. I stopped. I looked up. The lights were humming louder now, a rhythmic pulsing. Bzzzt, bzzzt. It sounded like a heartbeat, a mechanical heartbeat. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the lights. It was coming from inside my head. Or rather, it was being projected directly into my auditory cortex. The delay was gone. The processing was speeding up. The system was optimizing. It was learning my patterns. I took a step. Thud! The sound was instant. I took another step. Thud! Instant. I ran. The sound of my footsteps was a perfect metronomic rhythm. I couldn't deviate. I couldn't shuffle or scuff. My feet moved with mechanical precision, hitting the exact same spots on the carpet with the exact same force. I wasn't controlling my legs anymore. The input was coming from the floor. The ground was dictating my pace. I tried to stop. I couldn't. My legs kept moving. Thud, thud, thud. Panic didn't hit me. I was too busy being processed to feel fear. I was just an observer in my own body, watching myself run down an infinite hallway generated by a machine I couldn't see. I saw a door ahead, another one. This one was open. Light was spilling out of it, bright white light, not the yellow glow of the hallway, but a harsh, sterile white. I ran toward it. I couldn't stop. I was accelerating. The delay was negative now. I was hearing my footsteps before I took them. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was pulling me forward. I reached the door. I flew through it. I landed on my hands and knees on a hard white floor. The sound of the impact came a split second before I actually hit the ground. Smack. Then pain. The carpet was gone. The hallway was gone. I was in a room. White walls, white ceiling, white floor. No features, no textures. Just a smooth, endless white space. I stood up. The delay was gone. Everything was synchronized perfectly. I clapped my hands. Clap. Sound and action were one. I took a step. Tap. Instant. The system had caught up. It had rendered me perfectly. I looked around. There was nowhere to go. No exit, no door. Just white. I sat down. I crossed my legs. I waited. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was full of potential. The hum was gone. The processing was finished. I had been fully integrated. I looked at my hand. The skin was smooth. Too smooth. The pores were gone. The fingerprints were gone. It was just a generic hand shape, a default model. I looked at my clothes. They were gone. I was wearing a gray jumpsuit, a standard texture. I stood up. I didn't want to move. I didn't have to. The white room flickered. For a microsecond, I saw the wireframe, the grid beneath the surface. Then it was smooth again. I realized then that I hadn't escaped. I hadn't entered a new level. I had just been loaded into the staging area. The hallway was the preview. This is the final build. I closed my eyes. I didn't hear anything, not even my own breathing, because I wasn't breathing. I was just existing, waiting for the next input, waiting for the user to click the mouse. I opened my eyes. The room was smaller. The walls had moved 5 feet closer. I waited. The walls moved again, 5 feet closer. The space was optimizing. It was deleting the unused polygons. It was compressing the file size. I was running out of room. I pressed my back against the wall. It felt like glass, cold, smooth glass. I watched the opposite wall slide toward me, slowly, silently. There was no sound of friction, no scraping, just movement. I put my hands up to stop it. I touched the wall. It felt soft, like memory foam. It molded around my hands. It wasn't a wall. It was a buffer. It was absorbing me. I closed my eyes. I felt the compression. Not physical pressure, but data compression. My memories were being zipped. My identity was being archived. I felt the outline of my body blurring. I was losing my edges. I was becoming part of the background texture. I was becoming the beige carpet. I was becoming the yellow wallpaper. I was becoming the hum. I wasn't scared anymore. I was just waiting for the render to complete, for the scene to save, for the user to turn off the machine. The walls touched. The darkness was absolute. The silence was perfect. The file was closed. Wasn't worth fixing. I turned the corner into the corridor that led to the break room, expecting the familiar sight of the vending machine and the beat-up leather sofa. Instead, the geometry failed. The corridor stretched into a haze of sickly yellow light, the perspective lines running parallel into infinity rather than converging. The air was heavy and stagnant, smelling of warm dust, old carpet fibers, and the distinct metallic tang of ozone. It was the smell of a room that has been sealed for too long. I stood there for a moment, blinking, waiting for my eyes to adjust. They didn't need to. The light was flat and shadowless, illuminating everything with a uniform, clinical brightness. I had been walking for what felt like 10 minutes, but the scenery was a static loop. To my left, a wall of painted drywall, the color of margarine left out in the sun. To my right, identical doors spaced at precise, mathematical intervals. They were made of dark wood, the varnish cracked in a spiderweb pattern, the brass handles tarnished to a dull, unreflective brown. Above, the drop ceiling tiles were a grid of off-white squares, every fourth one sagging slightly with water damage, the brown rings blooming outward like a slow disease. The fluorescent tubes buzzed with a low electric headache, a sound that didn't vibrate in the air so much as it vibrated in my teeth. I passed a fire extinguisher cabinet mounted on the wall. The glass was missing, the red metal inside coated in a thick layer of gray dust. It was the kind of dust that motes in the light, suspended and frozen, defying gravity to hang there like static on a screen. I kept walking, my shoes making no sound on the dense industrial carpet. 1 minute passed. I passed another fire extinguisher cabinet. The glass was missing. The red metal was coated in gray dust. I stopped and turned around slowly, dread settling in my stomach like a stone. I looked back the way I had come. Another cabinet sat 20 feet behind me, then another. I was trapped in a linear copy-paste of a hallway segment, a lazy computer glitch in the architecture of the world. I didn't scream. Panic implies a threat. A bear in the woods, a man with a gun. This was different. This was mathematical. It was the geometry of the universe gone wrong, a syntax error in reality. I walked to the door on my right. I tried the handle. It was locked solid. The mechanism was stiff, unused. There was no give in the metal, no sign that it had ever been opened. I walked to the next door. I tried the handle. It was locked solid. The resistance was identical, a sharp catch at the halfway point, then solid metal stopping the turn. I walked to the third door. I didn't touch it. I just looked. The number scratched into the brass plate was 104. I walked to the fourth door. It was 104. I looked at the fifth door. 104. There were no other numbers. I started paying attention to the floor. The carpet was a low-pile industrial loop, speckled with blue and gray flecks, the kind designed to hide dirt, but managing only to look dirty itself. There was a stain near the baseboard, a dark, irregular shape like a spilled coffee. I stepped over it carefully. I counted my paces. 1, 2, 3, 4. I looked down. The stain was there again. I stepped over it. 1, 2, 3, 4. The stain. It was reappearing every 4 steps. The distance between the loops was shrinking. I tried to walk in a straight line, hugging the right wall to avoid the stain. But the wall moved. Not physically, but relative to the loop. Every time the room reset, the geometry shifted a fraction of an inch to the left. I was walking in a spiral, slowly converging on a point that didn't exist, tightening the noose of the hallway around me. I decided to test the pattern. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still. The hum of the lights seemed to steady, but the air around me felt like it was buffering, wavering slightly, like heat haze rising from asphalt. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling. It was shaped exactly like a boot print, a tread pattern pressed into the porous fiber. I closed my eyes. I counted to 10 slowly. I opened them. The boot print was there. I walked 10 steps forward. I looked up. The boot print was there. I walked back to where I started. I looked up. The boot print was there. The stain wasn't attached to the ceiling. It was attached to my perception of the hallway. No matter where I stood, the environment arranged itself so that the anomaly was always in the same relative position. It was anchoring me. It was forcing me to be the center of this dying world. I kept walking. The repetition became faster. The doors were appearing every 6 steps now. The fire extinguishers were every 12 steps. The world was running out of assets. It was reusing the code more frequently to keep up with my movement, recycling the textures because it had nothing else to give. I tried to run, to outpace the generation, to find a seam in the rendering. I ran down the hall. Thud, thud, thud. My footsteps echoed, but the echo was wrong. It sounded like it was coming from a different room, a delay of a half second that made me stumble. The lights flickered, not because of a fault, but because they were refreshing. The yellow light dipped to brown and then snapped back to yellow. It was a frame rate issue. The reality was struggling to load the corridor around me, lagging behind my velocity. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, but I never got anywhere. The corridor stretched on, identical door after identical door, a march of sameness that blurred into a singular, meaningless wall of wood. I stopped and leaned against the wall, gasping for air. It felt like plastic under my shoulder, not drywall, smooth and cool and synthetic. I looked at the texture up close. There were no brush strokes, no variation in the paint. It was a printed pattern, a high-resolution image of a wall repeated infinitely. I scratched it with my fingernail. A white line appeared, gouging into the material. I watched it. As soon as I took my finger away, the line filled itself in. The pixel shifted, the color restored, the wall healed itself. It wasn't just looping the space, it was maintaining the space. It was correcting my interference, erasing my mark on the world as if I had never touched it. I sat down on the floor. I looked at the baseboard. There was a gap where the carpet didn't quite meet the wall, a thin strip of gray concrete. I put my finger in the gap. It felt wet. I pulled my finger out. It was dry. I put it back in, wet. I realized the moisture was only there when I touched it. The sensation was generated on contact. Nothing here existed until I interacted with it. The hall was empty potential, waiting for my input to define it. I stood up. I walked to the center of the hall. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a different place. A forest. I pictured the trees, tall and green. I pictured the sun, warm and yellow, not this sickly electric yellow. I imagined the smell of pine, the crunch of needles under my boots. I opened my eyes. Yellow walls, buzzing lights, the smell of dust. The system rejected the input. It couldn't render those textures. It only had the office assets loaded. I started walking again. The compression was getting worse. The ceiling felt lower, pressing down on me. The lights were closer together, the hum blending into a single, deafening tone. I passed a door marked 104. I passed another door marked 104. They were inches apart now. The hallway was becoming a solid mass of wood and brass. I had to turn sideways to squeeze between the wall and the doors. The carpet was bunching up under my feet, the loops folding over each other like waves. I was trapped in a glitching save file. I pushed through the gap. I squeezed past the handles. They rattled as I brushed them, 1,000 tinny echoes. I felt a pressure on my chest, not physical, but informational. The density of the data was too high. The repetition was so tight that there was no room for me anymore. I found a spot where the repetition had stalled. The loop had frozen. The same 2 yards of hallway were flickering rapidly, resetting 100 times a second. The flickering was like a strobe light, erasing and rewriting reality in a heartbeat. The air here felt thick, like wading through water. The visual artifacts were getting worse. The door frames were tearing, showing the black void behind them. I stepped into the flicker. I felt a sensation of vertigo, of being unspooled. I saw multiple versions of myself, all standing in the hall, all looking confused. They were all me from different microseconds. They stacked on top of each other like a bad video exposure. I closed my eyes and let the sensation pass. When I opened them, the compression had stopped. The hallway was spacious again. The doors were 12 feet apart. The ceiling was high, but it was wrong. The colors were desaturated. The yellow was gray. The wood of the doors was black and white. The world was losing resolution. It was downscaling to save memory. I walked. My movement felt laggy, like I was controlling my body from a distance. The edges of my vision were blocky. The sounds were compressed into a flat, tinny track. I looked at my hand. The edges were blurry. The definition of my skin was fading. I wasn't leaving the hallway. The hallway was absorbing me. I was becoming part of the texture. I was becoming the repetition. I stopped. I knew what would happen next. I looked up. The water stain in the shape of a boot. I looked down. The coffee spill. I looked right. Door 104. The loop was perfect now. No delay, no variation, no errors. It had finally stabilized. I sat down on the floor. My legs ached with a dull throb that also felt repetitive. A a loop of pain. I waited for the refresh. I knew it was coming. The silence was not empty. It was full of the next repetition. I could feel it building in the air, the pressure of the pattern about to snap back into place. It was a heavy, static pressure that weighed against my eardrums. The hum would stop, the lights would flicker, and then I would be back at the beginning, turning the corner, walking into the haze. I wasn't lost. I was just a variable in a function that had no end condition. I closed my eyes. The hum cut out. The darkness was the only new thing left. It repeated, and then I was back at the corner, turning into the corridor, seeing the haze for the first time, or the millionth time. It didn't matter. I was the loop now. I didn't trip. I didn't fall. I just misplaced a step. One moment, I was walking down the linoleum corridor of the office building, heading toward the break room for a cup of lukewarm coffee. And the next, the angle of the floor shifted by a few degrees. The hard, cold surface turned into something yielding. The hum of the HVAC system changed pitch, dropping from a low drone to a high-pitched whine that vibrated in my molars. The air pressure dropped, popping my ears. I looked up. The drop ceiling was still there, but the tiles were a different color. Instead of the stark white squares I expected, they were a water-stained nicotine yellow. The fluorescent tubes were longer, running in infinite rows, flickering with a sickening, irregular rhythm. I turned around. The hallway I came from was gone. Just another stretch of yellow carpet and flickering lights. It looked like a cheap motel hallway stretched into infinity. I stood there for a moment, processing the shift. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I was confused. Confusion is a slow reaction. It takes time for the brain to reject the input and scream danger. I checked my pockets. My phone was there, but the screen was black. I pressed the power button. Nothing. No backlight. No vibration. Just dead plastic and glass. I put it back. I decided to walk. Walking is a default action. It's what you do when you don't know what else to do. I walked. The carpet was dense, absorbing the sound of my footsteps. It felt like walking on moss. I paid attention to the details. There were no doors on the left wall, just a continuous expanse of wallpaper with a pattern of tiny, looping geometric shapes. On the right, there were doors. Wood paneling, glass inserts, brass handles. They were all closed. I tried the first one. Locked. I didn't try the others. I assumed they were all locked. Assumption is a shortcut the brain takes to save processing power. I walked for maybe 10 minutes. The environment was consistent. The lights hummed at the same frequency. The air smelled of damp wool and dust. The temperature was a constant, uncomfortable room temperature, 70 degrees. Not hot, not cold, just neutral. I stopped to catch my breath. I looked down at the floor. My footprint was there, a clean impression in the nap of the carpet. I stared at it. It looked wrong. It was a disruption, an irregularity in the texture. I looked away, up at the lights, and then back down. The footprint was gone. The carpet was smooth. The fibers had sprung back up, erasing the evidence of my passing. I knelt down. I touched the spot. It felt identical to the rest of the floor. There was no indentation, no residual compression. It was as if I had never stepped there. I felt a chill, not a cold draft, but a conceptual chill. The space was rejecting my impact. I stood up and walked further. I wanted to test it again. I dug my heel into the carpet, twisting it, grinding the fibers into the backing. I made a mess. I tore a small hole in the fabric, exposing the rough weave underneath. I looked at it. It was a glaring error, a wound in the perfection of the hole. The hole was gone. The tear had knit itself together. The fibers were realigned. It hadn't grown back. It had just reverted. The file had been restored to its previous state. The concept of damage was being undone. I felt a strange urge to leave a mark that would stick. I reached into my pocket and took out my keys. I had a house key on a ring. I walked to the wall. I found a patch of bare drywall between two doors. I scraped the key against the paint. It made a screeching sound that echoed down the hall. Screech! I gouged a deep line in the plaster. White powder fell onto the carpet. I stepped back. I watched the line. It didn't fade. It didn't heal instantly. I watched the powder. The dust motes stopped falling. They hung in the air, suspended. Then they moved. They didn't drift. They flowed backward. They retraced their path, flying up from the floor and reattaching themselves to the wall. The line in the plaster filled in. The white color deepened. The texture smoothed out. The wall was pristine. The space was operating on a loop of causality, and I was forcing it to run in reverse to maintain the status quo. I walked faster now. I felt like I was being watched, not by eyes, but by a sensor, a presence that monitored the entropy of the room. I found a table in a small alcove. It was a round table with a pedestal base. On top of it was a lamp and a magazine. The magazine was open. I looked at the pages. It was a catalog for office supplies, staplers, paper clips, printer toner. I tore a page out. I crumpled it into a ball. I threw it as hard as I could down the hall. I watched it fly. It hit the floor, rolled and came to a stop. I waited. The magazine on the table rippled. A new page materialized out of thin air, ink and paper weaving together from nothing. It settled into place. The crumpled ball down the hall didn't fly back. It simply ceased to be. One moment it was there, a ball of paper. The next, it was just air. The atoms had been deallocated. The system didn't need to move the object back. It just deleted the object and spawned a new one in the original location. It was more efficient. It was cleaner. I started to run. I wanted to outrun the correction. I wanted to create a disturbance so big, so chaotic, that the system would lag, that it would crash. I ran past the tables. I knocked over the lamp. Crash! The bulb shattered. The porcelain shade broke. I kept running. I knocked over a chair. I kicked a wastebasket. Papers spilled everywhere. I was creating a storm of disorder. I ran for a minute. I turned a corner. I stopped. I held my breath. I listened. Silence. No crunching glass. No shuffling papers. Just the hum. I looked back. The corner I had just turned was empty. No overturned chair. No broken lamp. No spilled papers. The table was there. The lamp was upright. The bulb intact. The chair was tucked in. The wastebasket was empty. The correction had caught up. It had processed my chaos and nullified it before the visual data could even reach my eyes. It was fast. Impossibly fast. The latency was zero. I felt a pressure on my skin. It was subtle, like static electricity, but deeper. A magnetic resistance. I tried to move my arm. It felt heavy. The air was becoming viscous. I was fighting against the render rate of the world. I pushed my arm forward. It moved, but slowly, like moving through honey. The space was applying friction to my movement, slowing me down to a manageable speed. It was throttling my input. I stood there, fighting the thick air. I realized my posture was wrong. I was slumped. I was tired. My head was down. But my body was adjusting. My spine straightened. My shoulders pulled back. My chin lifted. It wasn't me doing it. It was the environment. It was correcting my form. I tried to slump again. I tried to look down. I couldn't. My neck muscles locked. My eyes were forced to look straight ahead. I was being posed. I was being normalized. The terror finally hit me. Not a jump scare, but a cold, logical understanding. I was the anomaly. I was the variable. The space was perfect. It was static. It was eternal. And I was the messy, biological intruder disrupting the pattern. To fix the room, the system had to fix me. I tried to scream. I opened my mouth, tightening my throat, pushing the air out. Silence. The air in my lungs vanished. The pressure in my chest equalized instantly. My vocal cords relaxed. The scream never happened. The action was deleted before it could manifest as sound. I stood there, mute, rigid, staring straight ahead. I looked at my hand. It was trembling. The tremor was rhythmic. Jitter, pause, jitter. It looked like a video glitch. The pixels of my skin were vibrating. The space was destabilizing my form because it couldn't render the irregularity of my fear. It was trying to smooth me out. I looked down at my feet. They were blending into the carpet. My shoes were losing their definition. The leather was softening, becoming a blur of brown and black. The distinct pattern of the tread was fading into the nap of the rug. I was being sublimated into the texture of the floor. I wasn't being crushed. I was being integrated. I was becoming part of the pattern. The geometric loops on the wallpaper, the rows of fluorescent lights, the beige carpet. I was becoming data. I felt a dissociation. My sense of self was leaking out of me, spreading into the walls. I could feel the texture of the wallpaper as if it were my own skin. I could feel the hum of the lights as if it were my own heartbeat. I looked at the wall again. There was a door. I hadn't noticed it before. Or maybe it hadn't rendered until I needed it. It was open. Darkness inside. I didn't want to go in, but I didn't have a choice. The floor moved. The carpet rippled, carrying me forward. I wasn't walking. I was being conveyed. I floated toward the door. I passed through the threshold. The darkness wasn't dark. It was just featureless, a lack of input, a blank canvas. I stood in the void. I waited for the correction. I waited for my form to be finalized. I looked at my hands. They were gone. I looked down. My body was gone. I was just a point of view, a camera, an observer. I had been fully normalized. The entropy was gone. The fear was gone. The biological mess of the human body was deleted. I was efficient now. I was consistent. I was part of the system. I hovered in the void. I felt a new directive, a command prompt in my consciousness. Observe, maintain, correct. I understood my purpose. I was the guardian of the hallway. I was the autosave function. I would wait here in the buffer until the next error occurred, until the next person misplaced a step. And then I would ensure that they too were normalized. The realization was peaceful. I wasn't trapped. I was optimized. I was the order within the chaos. I was the silence within the sound. I waited. The loop was beginning again. The hum was returning. The yellow light was bleeding into the void, and I was ready. The system was stable. The buffer was clear, and I was the keeper of the static.